Peter's military games, and the nearby village of Semyonovzo was annexed as well, leading to the creation of the Semyonovsky Guards. Once Peter became Tsar in his own right, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky would become the first two regiments in the Russian Imperial Guard. They would play crucial roles in bringing the future empresses Elizaveta and Catherine the Great to the throne, and they would endure until the fall of the Russian monarchy in 1917. After Peter, the rank of colonel of the Preobrazhensky Guards belonged to the Tsar by right, but Peter himself insisted on starting at the bottom ranks of his play army, as a drummer boy, only allowing himself to be promoted when he felt that his experience and abilities were suited to a higher rank. This was partly because drummer boys have more fun than the boy playing the rank of colonel, but even when Peter was older he rarely took supreme command of his armies, though he was always present when the most dangerous battles were fought. Peter's reign was distinguished by his insistence on merit-based promotions. In this, he often upset the boyars, who were accustomed to the privileges of precedence and did not like to take orders from anyone who was socially beneath them. But it became difficult for a boyar officer to argue when the son of a merchant was promoted over his head, when the Tsar himself was abiding by the same standards. Peter was anxious that his play regiments have professional instruction from real soldiers and officers. These, he recruited from Moscow's German suburb. Peter was fascinated by the military tactics practiced by European armies, and these foreign-born soldiers of fortune who had washed up in Moscow's foreign quarter were well equipped to teach him. Peter looked for other teachers as well. Before the age of 15, he learned carpentry, stonemasonry, printing, blacksmithing, and how to operate a wood lathe. Then, in 1687, he met a Dutch merchant named Frans Timmerman, who, at Peter's request, introduced the young Tsar to the art of shipbuilding. As the story goes, Peter and Timmerman were out walking one day when they came across a storehouse that had been locked for 20 years. Peter asked to look inside, where he discovered the decaying remains of what Timmerman identified as an English boat. It was like no boat Peter had ever seen before. Russian riverboats were similar to barges and had to be pushed along by the wind, the current, or by people manning oars or simply hauling the boat downriver with rope. Russia had only one seaport, and therefore Russia had no navy and no merchant fleet. Peter had never seen or even heard of a ship that was designed to sail against the wind in oceanic waters. He asked Timmerman whether the boat could be repaired, and Timmerman agreed to undertake the project. Once the boat was seaworthy again, Peter was on the water daily. Shipbuilding became his new passion. He spent much of 1687 building a boatyard on the shores of Lake Pleshev, where a crew of Dutch shipbuilders began construction on 2 frigates and 3 yachts. It was with great unwillingness that Peter left this project behind in 1688, returning to Moscow on orders from his mother. He was 16 years old. It was time. Both his mother and his sister Sophia agreed for Peter to be married. Natalia Narishkina disapproved of all the time Peter was spending in the company of foreigners. She handpicked his bride, believing that a sweet, pretty, obedient girl from a traditional family would be just the thing to capture her son's attention and anchor him back in Moscow, where the political climate was becoming unstable. Peter obeyed his mother's summons and went through with the wedding, but it was a disaster from day one. His wife, Eudoxia Lopukina, had been cloistered in a harem her whole life and had no education at all. She was everything a traditional Muscovite bride was supposed to be: painfully deferential, obedience, overawed by her husband, but Peter was bored senseless by her. They had 2 sons. The elder, Alexei, became his heir. The younger, Alexander, died as an infant. Peter was by that time so detached from his wife and his domestic ties that he did not bother attending the child's funeral. End of the Regency. At 16, Peter was the same age that his father, Tsar Alexei, and his grandfather, the first Romanov Tsar, Michael, had been when they came to the throne. He had long since reached his adult height of 6 feet, 8 inches. Visiting Swedish ministers, meeting the strapping Peter when he was 11 years old, reported home that he was at least 16, so impressive did he appear physically. By comparison, his brother and co-Tsar Ivan was weak, shy, and found it distressing when he was required to make decisions. The first few years of Sophia Alexeyevna's regency had been successful, even peaceful. She had successfully negotiated to retain Russian rights over Kiev in exchange for fighting alongside the Polish against the Ottoman Empire. This was the greatest triumph of her reign. But by the late 1680s, Russia was embroiled, through treaty agreements with Poland, in a war against the Crimean Tatars. At the head of this campaign was Sofia's foreign minister, chief advisor, and lover, Vasily Golitsyn. Russian forces met with heavy losses, and Golitsyn was forced to retreat on unfavorable terms. The Khan of Crimea refused to release Russian prisoners or cease his attacks against Ukraine and Poland. Nonetheless, Sofia greeted Golitsyn as a hero at the gates of Moscow and ordered Thanksgiving services to be held in the city's churches. In the names of Tsar Ivan and Tsar Peter, she lavished Golitsyn with rewards in the form of money and a country estate. Peter, however, refused his consent for these honors. He refused to attend the Thanksgiving services for Golitsyn's return, and when Golitsyn traveled to Peter's home in the country to offer formal thanks for the rewards Sofia had dispensed in Peter's name, Peter refused to see him. Everyone saw plainly and knew that the consent of the younger Tsar had not been extorted without the greatest difficulty, and that this merely made him more excited against the Generalissimo, wrote Patrick Gordon, a Scottish soldier who had advised Sofia during her preparations for war. This was the first time Peter had publicly challenged Sofia's authority as regent. He was old enough by now that such behavior could not be seen as anything but an opening gambit in a campaign to end the regency. The Russian court, sensing that a shift in power was rapidly approaching, began to pay greater attention to the young Tsar and his mother at their estate in Preobrazhensko. The atmosphere was tense. Unconfirmed rumors were circulating that Sofia intended to have herself crowned as Tsarina, setting her brothers aside, after which she would marry Golitsyn and make him Tsar. There was no evidence that she was planning such a move, save that a portrait had been painted of her wearing the traditional regalia of Russian autocrats, including the cap of monomaque with which all Tsars of Russia were crowned. But it is certain that, having tasted the freedom, power, and independence of being regent, she was fearful of being relegated to terem life once again. If she suspected the fate that awaited her after Peter gained his majority, perhaps she would have done something to deserve the charges that were being leveled against her. In June of 1689, tensions erupted between Sofia and the Miloslavsky faction in the Kremlin and Peter, Natalia, and the Narishkins in Preobrazhensko. Peter was beginning to resent Sofia's customary practice of appearing in royal processions on equal footing with her brothers. Sofia, feeling that she was only exercising the rights bestowed upon her at her brother's coronation, refused to take a lower place. Neither Peter nor Sofia could launch an open attack against the other without a good reason. Sofia was afraid that Peter would send the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments to attack her. Peter, having witnessed the savagery of the Streltsy attack against his relatives as a boy, worried that if Sofia ordered them to attack him, they would obey. In August of that year, Peter's worst fears seemed to be confirmed when Streltsy guards attacked a messenger Peter had sent to Kremlin. When Peter's retainers heard of it, they woke him in the middle of the night, telling him that the Streltsy were coming to murder him. Such was his terror that he fled 45 miles on horseback to reach his supporters, who were gathered at the fortified Troitsky monastery. There was no need for such panicked flight. Sofia had not ordered any attack against Peter. But it was difficult to explain what had really happened, and in any case Peter had decided that he was no longer content to be ruled by a regent. At Troitsky monastery, Peter was not only surrounded by his own supporters but by the walls of an impregnable fortress, which also happened to be one of the holiest sites in Russia. Even if the Streltsy attacked, they could not reach him there. But the Streltsy were not likely to launch such an attack. They were conservative, traditional, and blindly loyal to the Tsar. Lacking anything like political sophistication, they were uncertain how to choose between the duly appointed regent Sofia and the anointed sovereign Tsar Ivan on the one side, and the anointed sovereign Tsar Peter on the other. Peter decided to test his authority and find out which way the Streltsy would fall by ordering Ivan Cycler, colonel of the Strumyani regiment, to join him at Troitsky, along with 50 of his men. Once Cycler was actually in Peter's presence, he became obedient and humble, promising to do whatever Peter wished so long as he would protect them against any reprisals from his sister. Peter then wrote to the colonels of all the other Streltsy regiments, ordering them to leave the Kremlin and come to Troitsky, but they were as overwhelmed by Sofia's proximity as Cycler had been by Peter's. She threatened to behead any of the Streltsy that tried to leave Moscow, and the colonels, at least, listened to her. Day by day, ordinary soldiers were deserting the posts near the Kremlin to travel to Preobrazhensko and present themselves as faithful subjects of the younger Tsar. Sofia did not wish to attack, depose, imprison, or kill Peter. Throughout the summer, she attempted to reconcile with him. But reconciliation meant that Peter would remain under Sophia's authority, something he was no longer willing to do. In truth, once Peter realized that his greatest strength lay in the legitimacy of his position as Tsar, there was nothing Sophia could do to stop him from taking power. Since neither Sophia nor Peter was willing to fight, everything depended on the loyalty of the Streltsy and foreign officers in Moscow, like Patrick Gordon, who held key positions in the Russian army. The Streltsy, though they were 20,000 strong and capable of terrible destruction, were almost childlike in the deference to whoever they perceived as having rightful authority over them. The trouble lay in controlling this perception, because they were liable to being influenced. Peter, it turned out, was enormously influential, and many of the foreign officers had helped train Peter's play regiments when he was a boy. They knew his character well enough to understand which way the wind was blowing. On August 4, 1689, Peter sent a message to the Kremlin declaring that Fyodor Shaklovity, Sophia's chief lieutenant besides Golitsyn, had conspired against his life. He ordered that Shaklovity be arrested and sent to Troitsky to face justice. The news came as a shattering blow to Sophia. The Streltsy remaining in Moscow had come to realize that they were now on the losing side of the power contest between the regent and the Tsar, and they demanded that she turn Shaklovity over to them so that they might take him to Troitsky as a sign of their obedience. Sophia refused, until they threatened to